What's up, YouTube? Ryan Panny here. Hope you guys are doing reasonably well. I had to finally do this one. I mean, I fucking love this band. It's a band whose catalog I have some incredibly strong feelings about. It's a band that I know you guys love hearing about. Of course, we're talking about Pantera, the legendary groove metal pioneers who almost single-handedly carried metal music through the 1990s, at least when it came to the mainstream. They are, without exaggeration, one of the top 10 most important metal bands in the genre's history. And they also have, if not one of the top 10, then one of the top 5 most influential guitar players in the late great Dimebag Darrell. They've got such a fascinating story too, the way they evolved over time from this essentially glam metal group in the 80s into this just punishing, uncompromising behemoth of a band that essentially reshaped the entire metal genre with like a couple albums. And for the sake of just jumping into things right away here, because we got a lot of ground to cover, we are not going to be counting such magnum opuses as Metal Magic, I Am the Night, essentially any of the band's 80s material. Yes, I understand that frontman Phil Anselmo was involved with Power Metal, which was the album before Cowboys from Hell, but as far as we're concerned, the Pantera that we know and love was birthed with Cowboys from Hell, and I mean, we're gonna have enough debate between these 5 records, so sorry, 80s Pantera doesn't count. You know, in past Discography rankings, when I know my opinion is unpopular, I've kind of like sheepishly danced around it, like, look, I know you guys aren't gonna like this, but in this case, I'm just gonna go for it. I thought about this list enough, I'm not gonna apologize, and I hope you guys are entertained regardless. As always, please leave your list in the comment section, and let's just get right into it. Reinventing the Steel, number 5, the band's swan song. Now, this one does hold a special place in the hearts of a lot of Pantera fans, but here's my theory as to why. Reinventing the Steel was the only Pantera album that was firmly part of the Ozfest generation. You know what I mean? Like, kids who were born in the mid to late 80s, they got into this record the same time they got into Disturbed or Slipknot or Soulfly or whoever. So you find a huge chunk of the Pantera fan base where this is their favorite record, but it's mostly for that reason. Because for me, this album actually illustrates a really key point about Pantera. It's the same point that I make about Biggie and Tupac, which is they would have fallen off eventually. With these artists, we had this special snapshot of them in their prime, and then it just cuts out. The reality is, eventually, the formula wears down, the chemistry between Pantera clearly wasn't meant to last forever, and you hear a lot of that on Reinventing the Steel, which, from an artistic perspective, is kind of an ironic title. Look, I love All Cast a Shadow. I think that Revolution Is My Name is a powerful single. Yesterday Don't Mean Shit, that is a fan favorite and almost hardcore influenced workout song. Dimebag has some crazy riffing on here, whether it's Goddamn Electric or You've Gotta Belong to It. That's probably a favorite of mine. No one would deny there is good material on here, but they're also blatantly phoning it in at points. And whatever your preference between the different eras of Pantera, this album is the only example of that, of phoning it in. The noticeably lazy songwriting in Death Rattle or in We'll Grind That Axe for a Long Time, whether it's lyrically or the equally tired riffs and grooves that are being recycled underneath them. This is the only part of Pantera's career where you would have stopped and gone, huh, is Pantera like past their prime? It's a crazy thing to think about. I understand that these 2 tracks I've just pointed out are, you know, their latter album deep cuts. You can kind of be, you know, you can kind of mask in the rest of the album. But what about Hellbound, the opener? That's an underwhelming track. Let's put Hellbound up against some other Pantera openers. Cowboys from Hell title track, Mouth for War, Strength Beyond Strength, Great Southern Trendkill. I mean, it's not even fucking close. So not a bad album by any means, but this is definitely the one Pantera album where we can confidently label it non-essential. So now we rewind 10 years to the band's big major label debut, Cowboys from Hell, which was essentially the world's introduction to them, although Vinny and Dime at that point had been at it for like at least a decade. It's funny because we look at Cowboys as Pantera's big triumphant opening statement as this revolutionary metal band who just waltzed in and just remade the genre in their image. But when you actually examine it, it was very much a transitional record. The band were still in the process of shedding their glam metal skin, and they were quickly growing into this bruising groove metal style that they would become famous for. But because they were still very much in process, you have all this 80s residue that's on this album. You know, Dimebag Darrell was still very much Diamond Darrell, both in name and musically. Phil Anselmo was still doing all these goofy high notes. The lyrics are really campy. I mean, Cowboys from Hell, and you look at an intro to a song like The Sleep. I mean, that could have been on like a Dokken record. So when you think about the shock that the industry must have felt with the raw heaviness that was Vulgar Display of Power, which followed this album up, it makes sense in context, because on Cowboys from Hell, Pantera weren't really there yet. For me, the key weak link here is actually Phil Anselmo. His talent is obvious at this point in his career, but he really had not found his signature style yet. So on this album, he's really ping-ponging. He's doing macho tough guy 1 minute, and then he's doing full-on fucking nut-grabbing falsetto the next moment. He's doing completely clean singing, then he's doing gruff, like Hetfield-style singing. It gets the most schizophrenic and just unbearable, frankly, on tracks like Shattered and Clash with Reality. Dime, Vinny, and Rex sound a lot more confident in who they wanted to be and what they wanted to project than Phil did at this point. There are moments on Cowboys where the band's identity solidifies, most notably Domination, which is an all-time classic, and I've always used this song as kind of a shorthand for any track that's like a fast-paced ripper and then just ends in this sudden, crushing fucking breakdown. Like Machine Head's Davidian is a good example of that template being recycled a few years later. Also, Psycho Holiday, I gotta say, was monumentally ahead of its time in terms of groove metal. And they do get good mileage out of the 80s thing. Don't get me wrong, the fan favorite Cemetery Gates. You have the track The Sleep, which I think is really underrated and is based on this really unique riff. All in all, Cowboys actually has about as much as I like and dislike about Reinventing the Steel, but there's a big difference in chronicling a band on the way down versus on the way up. And Cowboys remains a really important part of their story with several just essential tracks. Okay, now the first of Pantera's 3 truly classic albums, the iconic Vulgar Display of Power. Like I mentioned before, the fucking quantum leap in terms of focused songwriting, in terms of innovation within groove metal, in terms of a new level of confidence and power, in terms of just sheer meanness. Between Cowboys and this record, it is absolutely insane. It is a completely different band in a lot of ways. All that leftover 80s sheen is just stripped away, both in terms of the songwriting and in terms of the production. The lyrics take on a much more visceral and personal and sometimes ugly tone. Phil Anselmo in particular goes from kind of jack of all trades without a home into the most singular and identifiable vocal performance of the 1990s. I mean, he just blends it all together. Hardcore punk, thrash, a touch of hip-hop with songs like No Good and Walk, a touch of traditional metal, and he just blends all of that together and matches some of the best riffs and grooves of all time with an equally perfect vocal. All that said though, this album is widely acknowledged as one of the top 10 greatest metal albums of all time, so now I have to say exclusively negative things about it so I can defend picking it number 3 as opposed to number 1, which is where most people would put it. So here we go. Number 1, it's front-loaded. The 5 songs everyone loves are the first 5 songs, and even within those, I find A New Level in particular to be the most overrated song in the Pantera catalog, with this really overindulgent bridge and solo section that I find really off-putting. But seriously, front-loaded. You get to the second half of this record, and sure, Rise, that's a blistering cut. I also think that Regular People has some of Dime's best riffing, but tracks like By Demons Be Driven, I mean, aside from the fact that it was in a really big Hollywood movie, 20 years later, that's kind of cool. Besides that, it's extremely uneventful and boring. I think Live in a Hole is a similarly slow-moving track. No Good has aged horribly considering some of the cringy nu metal stuff that came in its wake. I think people just remember the ballad Hollow as a very strong closer to the record, which it is, and they forget those pretty significant dips in between. The drums are relatively boring on here and a bit too minimalist at times, a bit too Black Album, if you will. The guitar tone, speaking of the Black Album, way too scooped. The mastering, way too quiet. Scooped guitars in particular actually actively prevent you from hearing some of the great subtleties in Dime's work, like those dissonant chords that show up in tracks like New Level or Regular People. Like you need really high quality studio headphones to fully appreciate Dime's rhythm playing on here, and that's no good if you ask me. So for someone looking to get into Pantera's music, the first 5 tracks on Vulgar are, I mean, it's some of the best and most influential metal ever laid down. It's a great place to start, but as a body of work, Pantera would go on to outperform A Vulgar Display of Power. Case in point, the criminally underrated Great Southern Trendkill, which, if this video does one fucking thing for you, I really hope it inspires you to look at this album differently. The Great Southern Trendkill holds 2 important superlatives in Pantera's catalog. First off, it's Dime's best rhythm tone. I mean, I suppose that's open to interpretation, but it's difficult to argue. And more importantly, it's the band's most dynamic album. And because of that, it's the one that may be the most difficult or the most challenging to get into at first, but then it's incredibly rewarding with repeated listens. I mean, the desolate masterpiece floods with one of the best guitar solos / outros ever laid down, the haunting and kind of folksy Suicide Note Part 1, which then segues into one of Pantera's most explosive and crazy songs, Part 2 of that track. Oh my God, so fucking heavy. Tens, that's another track that's just swimming in atmosphere and it is a lot different than what you're used to from Pantera. The song Underground in America, that brings almost like a blues rock, almost like a Down-esque feel to it. Drag the Waters, this might be a controversial opinion here, but in my opinion is the best single across Pantera's entire career. The way they just wrap that fucking ugly slow motion groove into this neat hooky bow is just, it's nothing short of genius. Genius. This album does everything. And it still gives you the most high octane version of what you want from Pantera already, what you're used to. The title track, like I said, Suicide Note Part 2, insane. Sandblasted Skin, Living Through Me if you want something a little more simple and straightforward. Like it or not, this is the album that will pay the most dividends over time for you. It's got a little bit of a different flavor. There's a little bit of controversy behind how it was made. There's a lot of turmoil in the band, but this is a really important album, and I think a lot of true hardcore Pantera fans will agree with me on that. And number one is Far Beyond Driven, their 1994 follow-up to A Vulgar Display of Power, and the heaviest album ever to top the Billboard charts. What's most admirable about Far Beyond Driven is that it is so myopically focused on one single thing, which is just being heavier and meaner than its predecessor. That's it. That's the only thing it's thinking about. Like, even down to the symbolism of the album covers. You know, Vulgar is a guy getting punched in the face, and on Far Beyond Driven, all of a sudden there's a drill going into his fucking skull, and legend has it that that drill was supposed to go somewhere even less flattering if the band didn't also have to, you know, sell records. But that's the brilliance of Far Beyond Driven, is it just has this one specific button that it's trying to push. And as happens in life often, if you focus on just one single thing, you're gonna succeed at it. And that's what happens here. Slaughtered is one of the most crushing metal songs ever written. So is Strength Beyond Strength, which is just such a thrilling beginning to this record, and even more so than Mouth for War was on Vulgar. In fact, nothing on Vulgar really touches this track in terms of heaviness. And then we get into the singles on this album, Becoming, 5 Minutes Alone, I'm Broken. All of them just dwarf their comparable moments on Vulgar. If not just in terms of pure heaviness, also in terms of the quality of the songs. Of course, they really upped the ante on the production as well. This thick and meaty kick drum that Vinnie Paul had is really one of the foundations of the record sonically. In general, the whole band is loud and uncompromising and right in your fucking face. I think Vinnie Paul in particular is the MVP of this record, though. He's the guy who really stepped it up in between records. I mean, the footwork on a song like Becoming is just insane. Throes of Rejection is another one where he really takes center stage. And speaking of the deep cuts here, like Throes of Rejection, the deep cuts are really what bring this record together. And they're also what expand the band's sound slightly. Because this album isn't all just increased heaviness. I use that to make a point, but they also go into some different territory here. You have the way they effortlessly slide in and out of tempos on the track Hard Lives. I'm personally a huge fan of the extreme metal flourishes in Use My Third Arm. I think they feel totally at home and totally natural despite being absent for the rest of the record. Shedding Skin is a track that tastefully incorporates some dark and dirgy, clean guitar passages. This is probably everyone's least favorite song, but one of my favorites is 25 Years. It's just so fucking Neanderthal and so just like aggression for aggression's sake. Like when we use the word uncompromising. How the hell are you going to listen to fucking Hostile and call it uncompromising when you have 25 years? It really brings new meaning to that phrase. It's almost like Pantera are testing their audience. Far Beyond Driven is one of the heaviest albums ever made. And it's a really important album because it's the album that I always use to illustrate the crucial difference between something that is heavy and something that is extreme. Nile is extreme, but Nile has never made anything remotely as heavy as Slaughtered or Strength Beyond Strength or Throes of Rejection. I think that is a really crucial distinction, and Far Beyond Driven is one of the best illustrations of that point. It definitely deserves a Essential Metal episode at some point, but for now, this will have to do. That was fun. I really hope you guys enjoyed this as much as I did. I also hope I've inspired you to go back and re-listen and realize that I'm right. And I look forward to seeing your list down in the comment section. And, never a bad time to celebrate this legendary band. And as always, thank you so much for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this video and are not yet subscribed to my channel, please consider doing so by clicking right over here, as well as checking out any other rock or metal related content that I publish here on a weekly basis. I really appreciate you guys watching, liking, disliking, just engaging in any fashion. Twitter, Instagram handle @RyanandPantyMusic. Again, thank you so much for watching, guys, and I will see you soon.